All right, John Paul.
Hi. Bonjour, Jean-Paul Rastul na Nishnakaz, Wajashk Nadodam, Okiganap Minising Nadonji, Nishnave and Dao, Wemidagoshi and Dao. I am joining you from the University of
Is
Victoria,
that,
which
yeah,
is
oh,
on
okay, so, yeah.
Lekwungen People's
So
Territory.
I can hear it through the
And
headphones,
it's
you mean?
always a great privilege to
Yeah,
be
okay.
a
Yeah,
visitor
yeah.
and guest here. I come from Anishinaabe Aki, the Anishinaabe territories east of here, and it's always good to connect with people across all these different nations. So great to be here with you as we talk about a very sensitive topic, broaching the G word, teaching about genocide. And just want to welcome you too, Angela.
Hi, John Paul. Thanks for that. And I apologize for a little bit of overlap of speaking there. We are getting off with a larger panel than usual today, so just ironing out the kinks, but we're very excited. Thank you for joining us, everyone. We've got two wonderful presenters joining us this evening. The first is Jasmine Wong from Facing History, and the second is Carmen Rodriguez de France from the University of Victoria. So I am joining you from Toronto, also the traditional territories of the Mississaugas, the Batoon First Nation, and also the Seneca. And yeah, as always, John Paul, this is really exciting to speak to you. This has been a question, I think, on a lot of people's minds, especially because the missing, murdered Indigenous women and girls report from the inquiry came out in June, and there was such controversy over the fact that they used the term genocide. So let's go to the experts right after we thank our sponsors. John Paul, what's going on with SSHRC?
Oh, they are supporting our webinar series. So part of it is a research project where we are looking at the best ways to help teachers take up Indigenous perspectives in their teaching. And so we are trying to provide some ways to do that in the webinar series, addressing topics that teachers tell us they want to learn more about. And at the end of the webinar, we hope that you take a little bit of time to fill out our survey, and that will help us better serve you, and it will help us report out to other teachers what are the kinds of things that teachers want and need to know to do the work better.
Wonderful. So folks, this is a participatory webinar in the sense that if you have questions for either of our guests in real time, please put them into the chat and we will do our best to bring them to our speakers, given the time. And so I guess without further ado, I'm going to invite, we've already done our land acknowledgement, I'm going to invite Jasmine Wong on. So please give us just a few moments to get her going. And in the meantime, I invite people to connect in the chat. Let us know where you're from and what you're teaching. And yeah, Jasmine, it's great to see you. Can you hear us okay?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me as well?
Thumbs up. Jasmine, I'm so excited about these slides that you've prepared, and can you, tell us a little bit about yourself? Who are you?
Thanks. I was a classroom teacher for a couple of years before meeting Facing History in Ourselves. It's international education, not-for-profit that really seeks to support teachers and students in facing history, in looking at these difficult histories as well as our contemporary reality, and learning from them and saying, how do we learn from these so that young people today can stand up against hate and bigotry? And so that's the mission and the vision of the organization. Been working here for in the Canada office for 8 years now, supporting educators from coast to coast to coast, and doing professional development and stuff like this. I know you started with a little bit about yourself in the land acknowledgement. I am also grateful and want to acknowledge that I am on the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, Haudenosaunee, and formerly the Wendat Nations. And I recognize that it is a big privilege to be here on this land and to be working on this territory. And thank you both for asking me to be here.
We're so happy to have you. Jasmine, I know you've prepared some stuff to speak with us. I wonder if you could start by just telling us a little bit about, Facing History does work around the concept of genocide. Tell us all about it. Like, How do you work with teachers?
Okay.
Go ahead. I'm so excited to hear all of it.
Thanks. So about over 40 years ago, the organization really started with 2 middle school teachers who started to encounter testimonies of the Holocaust. As we know, the Holocaust sort of formally ended in 1945, and yet it took almost about 30 to ask questions about that history. And for the 2 founders of Facing History and Ourselves, they said, this is so important. This is a history that we need to honor, to memorialize, but it's also something, and what genocide is, what it looks like, and how we get there, but to do it in a way where we are leading students safely in and safely out of these histories. What we don't want is for students to be looking at genocides and saying, A, I'm more interested in learning about the perpetrators because they're fascinating, or B, these are monsters and this could never happen to me, or I could never see myself as a perpetrator. We want students to be able to see themselves, to look at what we call sort of the universals of human behavior and psychology. There are universals around how we other each other, how we can begin to see each other and start dividing. And yet within these histories, there are so many particulars that we also need to know about. Each history within their own histories. And so the organization really is looking at how we can bring and bridge histories into the classroom, how students can be making deep connections, not facile comparisons between different histories or in their own lives, but really thinking about those universals and asking questions about what they see in the world today, where there's injustice. And, it's about empowering young people to recognize, but then to also act. It's about engaging in the world, to be civically minded and to say, I think I can do something, and I'm going to take some steps. And so Facing History's role, we publish resources. We put together scholar videos where we really feel like we need to bring scholarly voice in. We coordinate with survivor speakers in classrooms and with professional development and teaching contexts. And we run online as well as in-person professional development for educators. Because we are a not-for-profit and we love teachers and we're an organization of teachers, we also provide everything basically for free. All the resources are free to download or free to view.
Awesome. Yeah, no, absolutely. So tell us a little bit about, we're thinking about genocide. Like, what sort of definitions do you use in your organization? And how does this apply to Indigenous folks?
Yeah, so we did start with the core case study looking at the history of the Holocaust. And so out of that comes, really leaning on the legal UN definition, which is what you have here on your screen. Looking at Article 2, what is it that the UN has put out there? But we do this within the context of understanding the work of Dr. Raphael Lemkin, who first coined the term genocide. So if you can flip to slide 2. Or maybe I can. Can I?
Yes.
Yeah. So the interesting thing about Lemkin was that he began as a linguist. He was really interested in the power of words. And we know certainly as we study the history of residential schools, as we study the histories of Indigenous peoples, for Lemkin as a linguist, he believed in the power of creating a word that would be, first of all, legal, so holding perpetrators to account, but also as a form of prevention. He wanted to create a word that would carry such moral weight that when it was applied into the term genocide, that people would feel, I have to act. And he did this because he was, as a young person, really interested in studying difficult histories, in studying the history of the Christians within Rome, the Armenians in Ottoman Empire, and the Jews in Nazi-occupied Europe. And so when he thought about what it was that we needed to codify in international law, he thought of genocide, so genos being from the Greek word for a group, and sidere from the Latin root meaning to kill. But in his 1933 Madrid paper, he separated it out into two different components. One is around acts of barbarity. And so this is what we see a lot of in the UN definition. It's about killing people. A really important part of his treatise was really about acts of vandalism. It was about the destruction of cultural heritage. He felt that it was really important to protect cultural heritage because he believed that the legacy of human groups forms the wealth of all. So it was a crime against all of humanity. It was a crime against the future to cut off the cultural uniqueness of any particular. Lemkin is coming up with this term really within thinking about histories of colonization, which I think become echoes in women and the report. Began and the way in which we in more recent years there, such as Nam Sheikh out at Yad Vashem, Deborah Dvork, Doris Bergen, and Tommy Curry, who also pointed out that there's a need to examine gendered violence within genocide. And so that is, again, part of what we consider as we think about that term today and as we think about it as an organization. So this is what we have historically leaned on as the way that we think about that term and how we define it.
And so I'm wondering, as we go through, you know, you have this video that you showed. Is this a good time to provided us with? It's a private video from Facing History. Is this a good time to show it, do you think?
Asked me to consider was, you know, in what way has the definition of genocide that we have thought about really changed as we've begun to study our own history as Canadians, as we've begun to study the history of residential schools, of the 60s scoop, of the millennial scoop, and of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And so we have been really fortunate to be in relationship with a number of scholars, to read a lot of their works, but also to have a chance to interview some of them to deepen our own. A teacher resource for the folks who are out there who are interested in hearing directly from these scholars. So what we have here is a 3 or 4 minute clip. I promise be posted to the Facing History website to stream in coming months. It's not yet live.
Okay, well, thanks for sharing it with us in our webinar today. I'm just going to get it queued up at the 2 minute mark where, as you've requested. Just
the Dominion.
Can everybody hear it okay?
No.
We need to understand that particular convention as, if you like, a kind of boardroom compromise. It's not something that was generated with a clear and collective sense of what the law needed to be. By the time the convention is ratified and it becomes part of the United Nations governance structures, what we find is that it's been shorn of anything that might indict these very powerful nations with the charge of genocide.
There was a section devoted to the topic of cultural genocide, and that was Article 3 in the 1948 version of the convention before it went to the General Assembly and then was excised. And a couple countries that were very prominent in removing it were, of course, Canada and the United States. But many European nations and others were concerned about this because they saw sovereign nations having a right to assimilate what they would perceive as subject peoples who were considered to be, in their language of the time, primitive or backward.
And the result is that it's not particularly good law to use when applied to certain kinds of cases of historical violence, particularly colonial violence. Why? Partly because they have a long duration, right? And it's very difficult to think about the intent that the Genocide Convention talks about that can be sustained so clearly over 100, 150, 200 years. It's just difficult to think of it in those terms. And it leaves out and fails to recognize the genocidal aspects or character of the experiences suffered by many people who've had to live under colonialism.
So built into the Genocide Convention, around this notion of cultural genocide, is already a colonial mentality for understanding which groups are worthy of protection and which groups aren't.
I think if you look at the term cultural genocide and how it's in context with the term genocide or settler colonial genocide or colonial genocide, of course, cultural genocide limits how we think of the term and how we consider the history of residential schools. A lot of focuses on Section 2E, the transfer of children from one group to another, and I think that's an important distinction to make. A lot of legal scholars and a lot of political science scholars and people who look at the Genocide Convention from a legal perspective really focus in on 2E as they should. I try to look at the term cultural genocide from an Indigenous perspective, but also from a broader perspective in the way that Lemkin wrote the Genocide Convention and the way that cultural genocide fits into that bigger term is looking at, from an Indigenous perspective, physical, mental, spiritual, cultural, emotional parts of our life are inseparable.
Thanks, Jasmine. Is that pretty much where you wanted us to sort of
pause that? Pause it there. As you can see, there's just so much richness. There's so much that we've learned from these scholars. I mean, one of the things that both Muller and Wolford surface is, and Dr. Logan as well, is just that importance of that 2E. And this goes back to Lemkin's original intent. While he wasn't able to include that the acts of vandalism, 2E is in there. And Muller talks about this in a little later part of the video, that when you forcibly remove children, that cuts off that ability to pass culture from one generation to another. And so there is one piece of it in there. But it's interesting because as we have and broadening our thinking about that term genocide, which I mean Dr. Logan does so nice, so richly as well, layering on our understanding of what it means to kill. What does it mean to have for us to concept? We are more than physical beings, that there is an emotional and a spiritual and a relational aspect. And so helping to broaden that. But this work has also, if you can, let me see if I can flip to the next slide. Maybe you can flip to the next. Okay. Gotcha. We've also done some learning about what it means to have the definition of genocide and how do we talk. And so this was sort of working with David B. scholar on genocide. When Canada ratifies the UN reservations, it's the definition. We've treaty to that. The UNGC and selectively that portions in 1952 we took into our criminal code B, so it excludes to that condition preventing births. History raises some really interesting questions. 2000 national definition of criminal law in Crimes Act is that have updated our expanded the number of protected groups. For example, gender as a definition. There's still these two pieces of our criminal code. And this raises some really interesting questions, particularly as we think about the importance of those particular pieces. So as we think about the legal analysis of genocide, I mean, this is where the 2000 bringing into the criminal code of C, D, and E really matters. And certainly Corinne Dumal, who we've worked with, and who was one of the lead researchers on the legal analysis of genocide for the supplementary report, this is core to her case, because so much of the evidence around genocide lies in this particular space, in the removal of children, in thinking about the longevity of colonial genocide, as opposed to that framing that we have originally in thinking about Lemkin and this moment, right? When we are framing our understanding of genocide around the Holocaust, which is sort of historically where our understanding comes from, there's more of a discrete, in the legal sort of sense, they were tried for analysis of genocide really opens up, challenges the way that we anchor our understanding on that particular idea of discrete or defined moments. I think in the case of colonial genocide, we can find historical intent. There's very clear evidence of that in the statements that were persistence of systems and structures that continue colonial genocide over centuries. And that's something that they've really introduced and really broadened our thinking around. It's also been really explicit in reiterating that idea that there are missing the UN. We now consider within sort of the history thinking those voices in the development of the UN definition. And so about, this is, I think it is incumbent to think about this work. If it is not a, how do we understand it? Is that it protect people, to hold people to it.
So we wanted you to talk a little bit about, the different age levels that you speak about genocide at, and how you maybe differing approaches with the time you have left. Yeah, can you sort of start us off there?
Because the work we do is to work genocide in the classroom across teachers who want to know. And I think this is where we really have to know our. What are they actually giving idea about own history, but to understand it gives them an aha. Better understand. Now I can name in the world around me. It might not have to be like when we also think and how we introduce gender for safe or it's a difficult word of it's histories, and it's easy to talk about ways and so we all readiness. I think if it's scholars that we typically around middle grade 6, 7 to not right. So just going to be happening to make sure that they are sort of mentally, but also there's might be, and do you think you'll be uncomfortable questions honestly. This, if we answer them, we can't answer that. We have to ask ourselves, about able to answer them for all the students in our classroom. Assessing prior knowledge is, counter that of trauma. So we want to make sure their first encounter with the humanity. It's of any group been done in previous. There is, I'm being video bombed.
I was going to say, you're having your own viral moment, though we're loving what you're saying in your viral moment, and it's really bringing the humanity to what you're saying. So that's really perfect.
Yeah, and then the other thing I would say of identity, right? Students to be thinking about these bigger questions of what and belonging forms of foundation, and start diving into history groups that are not our own. Hey, I'm really complex. So, these kinds of instances. Stories of school and start with literature, both historical and entry point before we.
John Paul, we only have about 3-4 minutes left with Jasmine. Do you have any questions or things that have really stood out to you about what she said so far?
With a question, and I thought maybe we could pose this to Jasmine.
Sure.
To use synonym for genocide for groups who may be sensitive to that, comfortable with how do you feel about you trying to talk about it in a and
I legal definitions. The reason that they do carry tended to be. I think we need happening. If students the full definition, then what are they ready for? You're teaching younger kids that conversations around identity in ways that students can understand. Planned mass atrocities. We need to be or not. And I think typically that we have these kinds of sort of real conversations.
Was a book about bullying. Actually, as I was flipping through it, because I thought, oh, but it quickly to Holocaust and of one group and comparison very explicit. That kind of a.
So I'm familiar with a sort of author who organization facing history and ourselves would say it's bullying to genocide. They are sort of level of planning, a different level of psychology. It's universals and particulars. What does it feel like to want to, that's very surface. However, the particulars, so particular, a planned, and something like that would
Thank you. You know, there's so much that I'm learning about this topic tonight from you, Jasmine, and the really careful work that you're doing at Facing History. I'm wondering, you know, just because I'm looking at the time and we're going to move on to our second presenter, can you leave us? And I also want to acknowledge Hazel, I see your question and perhaps we can pose in the second half. So please hold that. Jasmine, I'm just wondering, is there any sort of resources that you can leave teachers with? You know, maybe one or two beautiful things that you recommend as we enter into this topic.
Oh, I can. Ooh, okay. Resources that we have. The in search of a name, it would really looks, and then we have a available as a. If you want to learn more, as well as the development of the international and two around what a sort of fight this sky is a fantastic website.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for joining us. I feel like we could do 3 hours with both presenters, and wow. So again, I really want to thank you. And I really am left with this idea of moving safely into the topic and safely out. So yeah, that really stuck out for me. So thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Jasmine. So we will switch over to Carmen in the video, I think, and then, or hopefully there will be no audio issues. We were working on some of those when we first started, and I think we've got them sorted. And I just want to give, hi, Carmen.
Hello.
Want to give Carmen an opportunity to introduce herself.
Well, first and foremost, my apologies for not being able to join for the whole session. Jasmine, what I heard from your session was really exciting. So yeah, I'm looking forward to learning more from you and with you. And I'm really grateful to Jean-Paul and Angela for inviting me to join the session. And my first slide, as you can see, just expresses gratitude because I'm a visitor, have been a visitor on the Lekwungen and Senchothin speaking people's lands for the past 22 years. So I feel really privileged, very blessed, and also with a deep sense of responsibility and gratitude to share what has been shared with me. So thank you for having me.
To have you. And Carmen, I'm wondering, just briefly, could you just tell folks just a little bit of what you do at UVic?
Yes, so my main responsibility in the Department of Indigenous Education is to work with future teachers, with teacher candidates who are in their fourth year usually, or final year of their program, taking a course on Indigenous education. And within those 12 weeks, we try really hard to encourage and invite the teachers to shake off their fears and their concerns with regard to how to do this work that we are now provincially responsible for doing as per our curriculum for the past 3 years now. And so because I'm also a person who was not born in this place, I feel sometimes that I'm in a good position to walk with them these fine lines and these complexities of bringing in Indigenous perspectives to the work we do, as educators, not just as teachers, in our classrooms and outside of the classrooms with our community, establishing relationships, because I walk on those paths and on those shoes as a newcomer, as an international student at the university. And so that situates me, I think, in a position of advantage, and sometimes in a position of disadvantage in some ways. So we part from the perspective of how we carry our privileges and our gifts, and how we also remain humble in our processes of constantly needing to learn because we are teachers.
Thank you, Carmen. In our discussion of genocide today, you know, and in your work with teachers, what I'm curious is, do you use the term genocide in your work with teachers? And if so, you know, how do they react to it?
Well, yes, as Jasmine was saying, it's a very delicate word and a complex one. And the way in which I use it relates to the legal definition, as Jasmine was pointing out, but I also emphasize the wording from the Truth and Reconciliation report that refers to cultural genocide. And so I try to move within those definitions to present a broad perspective of what this has meant throughout history. Our course focuses on Indigenous education and Indigenous worldviews. So I go from the general definition of genocide in its legal forms, also the UN Convention of Rights for the Indigenous People, and the Truth and Reconciliation report, as well as referring to some documents, academic journals, for example, or book chapters that have addressed the word in different ways. My perspective is that, in my experience, it has been a little bit easier for my students, these pre-service teachers, to understand the depth and the breadth and the scope of the word within the context of Indigenous worldviews and cultures. So I try to parcel that out as I go through the course. And also, when it's pertinent, making comparisons to other groups around the world. So the extermination of Jewish people, the extermination of people, you know, the Tutsis and others in Rwanda, and try to bring in those pieces of history so that the students themselves, instead of me saying, well, this is what genocide was about, they can make their own conclusions, and they can have an understanding of how the term applies and has been applied to Indigenous context within Canada.
About it, what do you find that the reactions are? You know, because one of the things that I remember very clearly speaking about genocide years ago, maybe 10 years ago, to a group of teacher candidates, and as soon as the word was spoken, I lost the table right away. You know? I'm wondering, do you find the same reaction? Like, or are people more willing to identify what's happened and what is happening to Indigenous folks on Turtle Island as genocide?
Well, that's an interesting observation, because I had similar reactions 10 years ago when I started teaching this course. Cross arms, cross legs, closed hearts, really, in terms of appreciating the histories. And I tend to think that, or I want to think that has to do with lack of knowledge and awareness, and that the resistance had to do more with not knowing what had happened during the time of residential school, during the time of the 60s school, compared to what I find these days, 10 years later. The students, there's still a lot that everybody needs to learn, including myself, but I find that they come with disposition, and that I don't lose them at the initial conversations when we talk about privilege, when we talk about identity, when we talk about our responsibilities and our accountabilities as educators. There is that openness to hear, okay, well, tell me what you're trying to say here, and let's work together. So there's less resistance to any of these words that confront us with ourselves, right? Like Jasmine was saying, and I think I really like the name of the program, of the project, because it's really looking inward before we make judgments about society and about the world. Is really looking at who we are and what is it that we have within us to work us through these complexities, and if there is resistance, where that is coming from. So those are also early conversations that I have with the students. In the first few sessions, we tackle that. I used to do that at the end of the course, and I have found in the past 5 or 6 years that it has been more effective to do that at the beginning and say, okay, so if we're going to be talking about reconciliation, we have to start with ourselves. Where do we position ourselves? Where do we locate ourselves within all this project, the larger project? So yes, words can still be intimidating, and I think that for me, as a speaker of English as a second language, there are some words that carry a very heavy meaning, and I find it helpful for myself to try to tease out those complexities and deconstruct them by talking about what is entailed when we talk about cultural genocide, or what does it mean when we talk about planned, organized extermination of a peoples.
I appreciate that idea of like starting with the self, because so oftentimes I know for me, when I'm nervous about teaching something to a group, it has more to do with me necessarily than the group, right? And if there is maybe any resistance within the group, if I faced it in myself already, I feel I'm more able to address it head on. So thank you for bringing that out. I'm curious too, when we ended off with Jasmine speaking about this, but from your perspective, when you're speaking to teacher candidates, at what age are we talking to them about introducing ideas around genocide to their students? At what age group?
Well, I also found that a very interesting question, because when it comes to these topics that are difficult ethically and socially, and from the social justice perspective, I ask the students, when they are preparing a lesson plan, or when they prepare an activity around a particular book or resource, I ask the students, the first question that they need to ask ourselves is what is it that I want from teaching this material? Because when they are introducing a resource for residential schools or for any other similar topic, I tell them, you cannot just go about, well, I'm going to take this and I'm going to talk to the children about residential schools, or I'm going to talk about how difficult it was. What is it that I want out of this particular resource? What is it that I want out of this particular lesson? And sometimes most often, what I'm looking for is that accountability piece. So that issues like Jasmine was addressing in terms of the fear or the creation of safe and courageous spaces takes precedent. So in terms of at what age do we introduce these topics, I would first ask, what is it that I want? What kind of response, what kind of reaction, what kind of learning, what kind of outcome do I want from my students in introducing these topics? Do I want to tackle the historical piece, which will be factual? Do I want to tackle the social justice piece? Do I want to tackle the political issues among nations around the world? And it can be all of the above. But if I tackle all of the above, then I need to be really conscientious and very aware of why I'm introducing these topics. And with the why, to me, along with the why comes the when. So I would first ask, why do I want to introduce it? What am I looking for in terms of a response or a connection, or self-reflection or self-awareness from the students? I think that there's always a way in which these complexities can be introduced. And while I appreciate Jasmine's perspective on the book that you mentioned, Jean-Paul, in terms of escalating from bullying all the way to genocide, and there's a big gap in terms of how things happen, I I try to invite my my student teachers into those conversations. That it has to be, for me, like many other ways of learning, it has to be scaffolded. And what Jasmine was saying about, well, finding out if what kind of prior knowledge the students have, conversations from their home, access to newspapers or other materials or other resources, and how comfortable they feel also in terms of working with these topics, working with these issues. I think that one can approach sensitive topics with ease and with my in community and at the university, that we can talk about these as long as we. So also what just trying to induce blame not help, and sometimes no matter what we do, and our somebody will feel in distress or less or guilty. I think that exposures need to be scaffolded with work with similar grades. Work of the so it project, so it can be very similar perspective in terms. Will be invited to these conversations, how to create these safe and courageous spaces for the students to have discussion about some of these issues, because sometimes I think as teachers we tend to focus on what the lesson plan says of the curriculum, and we may or may not be aware of what is happening around the world, and what other comparisons we can bring, so that also it doesn't become just national issues, so that the students can have an understanding of larger world perspectives and how the idea of genocide has been enacted, understood, and
Thanks, Carmen. And I'm wondering at this moment, before we keep moving, John Paul, is there any sort of something that's standing out to you right now, or a question that you have before we move on?
But I'm kind of curious what to do about resistance from the classroom. I get yeah. In the Americas. Have you experienced that? And if you have, what kind of response?
Well, so yeah, the initial responses sometimes from students and sometimes I think that, again, out of awareness, they tend to believe events in the past, intentions that went wrong. Something happened along the way. For politicians or governments or groups to maybe the result of a war, or it was maybe a policy that didn't go the way of the students, to how or is discussed. And in my start from talk about genocide in Canada or in the Americas, because I'm familiar with the Holocaust. And so I was talking about how this is in her bones, how this is in her life. Didn't survive the Holocaust. So how do you talk about genocide? How do you talk about these atrocities to your own children? She says, how do I approach my own experience of my father being killed? Not only to create sensitivity, students to be closer to a reality might not know much about as it pertains to Canada. So I tried to first create that sensitivity so that when I introduce the idea of genocide within the Americas, is not foreign, and it's explored with the same care and with the same respect that they show for other cultures or other peoples who have been exterminated. And it's a process that it's unfortunately not enough in the time we have in the term to approach or to discuss, because we also have other aspects. But most often is an unfinished conversation. And there has to be an invitation for the students to continue that conversation with others, with their peers. It is unfortunate that we have limited time to really go into depth into these conversations. So the reactions are very different, and one can only do so much to ease those feelings of confusion and clarification or lack of clarification.
Thank you, Carmen. I'm wondering, just looking at, we only have only a few minutes left, which is blowing my mind, because again, oof. Carmen, is there a particular video you wanted us to show? I know we have two of them queued up for you.
Yes, they're just brief videos, and the first one is just something that I also present to my students. So if we go to the next slide, that talks about different perspectives. So
an event seen.
Oh, Carmen,
yes.
I'll play it on my end. Okay.
Touch it? I don't know.
That's okay. I think I just want to make sure. So I'll press play.
Perfect.
An event seen from one point of view gives one impression. From another point of view, it gives quite a different impression. But it's only when you get the whole picture you can fully understand what's going on.
That's the video. So if you can show that.
Sure.
Please.
Yes. Just one moment. Sure. I apologize.
No, that's fine. So the previous one, that one. So when we're talking about these delicate issues, and once we explore them, I show the students there is a word, but some people see first the face, and some people see the word liar across. And that, and then some people can find both right away, and you see one or the other, depending on what of or reiteration of how once we see or learn a truth, cannot not see the face or the word ever again. When we see that image again, so when we create this awareness about any of these issues around social justice or genocide, then I ask them to think, well, what is the next step? Now that I'm aware of the as an educator, now that I have this awareness. And it's usually very effective because then that just shows visually what are our next steps, or for it hopefully encourages us to think about our next steps in terms of, okay, now that I know this, because that's another apprehension that the teacher candidates have, not knowing what to do after they have learned all these realities and all these truths. Entrusted with these notions, and then what is next? Where do I put all this knowledge? Where do I put all these feelings? And that's something, and to put in the place where they correspond. Hopefully not in a place of guilt and shame or fear that stops them from doing in the sphere or in the realm of the heart that speaks to the compassion and the truth and the responsibility educators we have. If one wants to be called oneself an educator, then one needs parents entrust us with every day as teachers in the classroom. So once we have, how do I teach? How do I go about these issues? When do I introduce them? Results.
Thank you, Carmen. I'm wondering, I'm just looking at our time. We have about 2 minutes left in our hour, which is like blowing my mind. So I don't know, John Paul, do you feel like if Carmen might be available, if we could go a little bit over, or what's your time like, John Paul?
Yeah, we can do a few minutes over. I think it would be good to get to a couple of the questions, give Carmen a chance to answer, Jasmine too, if that's a possibility.
Yeah, so how about this? Why don't I'm going to invite Jasmine back on. I'm not sure her timing, but I'm going to invite her back on, and I will close my video because we can't all. John Paul, do you want to facilitate questions?
Sure. I was interested in the question that Hazel asked some time ago about the opinions that you might have about the suggestion that an elder, a residential school survivor, given the advice, let forgiveness be your guide to healing. That brings up that whole notion that, and in some way, that victims of genocide and genocidal attempts might be in this position where they are to be forgiving the ones who did this, or the structures. And I've heard this kind of discourse many times. I just wondered what you thought about it.
I have different notions about their healing. And Cindy Blackstock says that she has only heard. He said, "How come non-Indigenous people?" And so that gets me to think about what the meaning to heal ourselves, our relationships to the land, with each other, and so forth. Different responses from different communities in which I have been. But usually the elders say that far, and that help them in their approach to life after these experiences is the idea to themselves, to understand that it was not their fault, to understand that it had nothing to do with who they are as human beings, but more about a system, as institutions, as ideologies that permeated throughout time. So as a person who was not born here, I can only follow that and try to align from people who belong to these communities.
Yeah. So one thing that jumps to mind is actually Simon Wiesenthal's book, The Sunflower, in which he talks about a perpetrator of the Holocaust asking for forgiveness. And he talks about his own journey and where he ends up. And then he opens it up to really the world. And he said, if you have also survived a comparable trauma, what would you do? Would you forgive? And there's a range of responses. And I think that that's true, that there is a range of responses. It's not, different people will have different philosophies, have different support systems. I don't think there is a one-size-fits-all answer. But I also think about one of the podcasts I listen to is Dr. Laurie Santos and the Happiness Project, and she does a lot of work sort of explaining the research around trauma. And I think that there's a piece around healing that is, I think, it's about acknowledging what has happened. It is about confronting it, but it's also about finding people who are willing to listen and to accept the truth of what they're saying. So if you are in an environment where the truth is not accepted, then it limits healing. It's not just about, and I think, other folks have talked about what does it mean to forgive, ongoing genocide, or what does it mean to forgive over 150 years of trauma? What is our human capacity for that, and how do we even grapple with that question? So I don't think there are simple answers, but there is certainly a lot of. I'm really happy for the question that was raised.
To that deep question, and to know too that in my sense too, I've known some folks who grapple with that over a lifetime, and their answer yesterday will be different from their answer 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 5 years ago. They go through that whole range of experiences just in their own person too, from I will never forgive to I couldn't stop being angry until I felt some sense of forgiveness. And of course, that's not everyone's path, but just to know that it varies so much across communities, across cultures, that even within individuals. So we have to be mindful, I think, of the many different responses one could have to that kind of a question. So thank you for making us think about that a little bit more. One of the other things I noticed from doing these webinars too is that we only ever really scratch the surface on any of these topics, and there's always so much more that we could learn and discover. And I think you've started pointing us in the way of a few resources that will help us deepen our thinking about these issues, and there's always so much more to learn. I wonder if you would both want to take a moment to have a final thought or any last words you'd like to share about this topic, and we'll start with you, Jasmine, if that's okay.
Sure. Thanks. I actually really just want to reiterate Carmen's thinking that when we were talking about genocide, that we do want students to understand the whole picture. We want them to have the evidence to build up their own understandings, but then also to feel compassion and to really be thinking about what do we do. Dr. Roger Brooks, who is the CEO for our organization, wrote a piece in our blog Facing Today looking at how we use words. We have to be particular about how we use words, but words don't rarely belong to particular moments in history. And what we don't want to be distracted by when we are talking about semantics is that ultimately there are human beings who are experiencing pain and trauma. And that ultimately our responsibility is not to get hung up on words, but to be thinking about what we're going to do to act. How do we advocate? What's our role? What's our responsibility?
Oh, I was just thanking Jasmine for that. Go ahead, Carmen.
Yes, and I semantics, language have, and the understanding and the images they create in which we approach the world, right? The way in which, because language informs, also creates a way of relating to others and even to things around us. And so moment to stop and think how the words, because that will also inform. So yes, I think we're, and recommend also one by Judith Butler called has more questions than great, because reference to war and how we pay attention to the, when is life grievable, when do we mourn for some, and how do we learn those boundaries about whom we are responsible and beyond our immediate context. For one's own professional bring into a classroom, or age grades, age level, in terms of thinking about ethical, social responsibility. So that's one book that I would us with in terms of.
Thank you. I just want to thank you both for being so generous with your time and your wisdom, for opening up many more questions. I think that was a great resource to share, because I'm leaving here today with more questions as well. And I would hate to think I ever had the answer. There is no one answer. But this has certainly given me a lot to think about in how to do this work going forward. I really like the notion too of moving toward action and thinking about how we can turn all of our learning into action on these issues. And so thank you for that. It's good to be reminded of one of the reasons we do all this work is to make a better world. So Chi miigwech to both of you. Thanks very much. This video will be available online soon, and Angela will be able to share with you where you can find it. We'll just do a little bit of editing to before we put it up, and it'll be available as a resource for all of you. Thank you, all of our attendees, for coming and participating this evening, and please share the word with other teachers and learners, and then we can certainly reach more people than we were able to this evening. I know everyone has very busy lives, so it's good that you took some time out today to share with us. I'm very grateful. And one other thing we ask you to do before signing off today is to click through on the link here and take a quick survey. Doesn't take very long, but it helps us to plan future webinars. It helps us to support teachers in their learning, and to make it easier for you to, not necessarily easier, but to assist you in bringing Indigenous perspectives into your teaching and learning. I learned this word the other day about sitting in discomfort as an important place to be when you're doing education work. So it's a useful one when you think about Indigenous education, and especially around this topic of discussing genocide. So thank you both again. And Angela, I don't know if you have any last words you want to say.
To all of you, this was amazing. Never enough time. These webinars are available at angelanardozzi.com/webinars, but also I will be sending out the link to everybody who signed up. And we have another one coming up next month, which I have posted in the chat about the Junior Water Walkers program. I'm going to be rewatching this webinar that we've done today. I don't feel like I've fully been able to take in all of the amazing things that were said. So thank you both for giving us so much to think about and to act on.
Thank you. And Chimigwech.
Thank you. Yeah, Chimigwech to both.
Good night, everyone.
Night.
Good night.
Thanks.